Barbro, Professor Barbro Melgert from Groningen, which is in the Netherlands, in case you didn't know, and actually a massive powerhouse of respiratory science. Again, not always known to those that don't peek around the corner, but the Netherlands in general, and especially Groningen. I met her several years ago talking about this beautiful little cell called the macrophage that goes around eating up particles, and then I noticed several years later that she had gotten into plastics, as you'll see, and I think it's a huge area that we're going to have to understand a lot more about, so I'm glad that she came to talk about this. And I'd like to welcome her up, Barbro, and thank you for coming, making the trip.
Well, thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here and listening to my talk. And I'm going to add to the general depression and talk about yet another adverse effect of our addiction to oil, and that is plastic pollution. And I was told that we have this competition with songs, right? So I got inspired for my title by a song from Aqua called Barbie Girl, and one of the lines is, "Life in plastic, it's fantastic, but is it?" So I'll let you decide in 20 minutes whether it's fantastic or not, and talk to you about microplastics. I have no conflicts to disclose. And I want to start with a little survey. Just look at your top, and maybe you know what it's made of. It could be made of polyester, cotton, linen, nylon, a blend, or maybe you don't know because, like me, you cut out the label because it was itchy. All right, that's not on the list. So who's wearing polyester? Who's wearing cotton? Wow, good to see that. Linen? Not the season yet. Nylon? Wow, that's good news, guys. But we're probably on nylon carpet, so hold on to that thought. Who's wearing a blend? Quite a few people, yeah. And who doesn't know? Also quite a few people. Okay, so hold on to this thought. We'll come back to that at the end of the talk, whether this was a wise choice of clothing or not. So what are microplastics? Microplastics are small particles between the sizes of 100 nanometers and 5 millimeters. And they come in different shapes. I've listed some shapes here. And usually they're degradation products of larger pieces of plastic. So the tire wear has been mentioned, but also synthetic clothing. It sheds fibers when you wear it and when you wash it. But microplastics could also be small by design. Think about toothpaste and scrubs that use microplastics as for their abrasive qualities. So why should we care about these microplastics? And I can't say it better than Jodie Whittaker did in this recent episode of Doctor Who, and I'll let you watch the clip and make up your mind about microplastics. Okay, the sound is not working.
It's in your water. Humans have flooded this planet with plastics that can't be fully broken down, so much so that you're ingesting microparticles whether you know it or not. You're poisoning yourselves as well as your planet.
Okay, at least the last message got out there. So yes, we are poisoning ourselves. Microplastics have been found everywhere. So on the top of the Himalaya, in the Mariana Trench, in your blood, in your lungs, in placentas, everywhere. So most of the information about plastic pollution is actually out there on pollution that you see in the seas and the waterways. So you'll probably recognize these pictures. But a lot of people don't realize that it's not just a water problem. Microplastics are also in the air, right? And studies have estimated that the outdoor fallout of microplastics is between 2 and 1,000 particles per square meter per day. And a recent study in Holland looked at the types of microplastics in the air outdoor and found that 35% of that actually is from tires, 25% from packaging, and a lot was miscellaneous. So outdoor air, most of it is well, rubber related. But we spend most of our time indoors, and microplastics are indoors too. And the levels are much higher, so up to 10,000 particles that fall out per square meter per day. And in that case, it's most often polyester, for those who are wearing the polyester shirt, polypropylene and nylon. Nylon from the carpets and other furnishings in our house. All right. So the indoor air levels are much higher. If you, just to put this into perspective for you, if you imagine that the average house collects around 20 kilos of dust per year, and studies have shown that 30% of those fibers are synthetic. That means, if you calculate that back, that you have around 300 bottles of plastic bottles in your air per year in your house that could potentially end up in your lungs. But do they end up in your lungs? And that's where size and shape matter. And this has been talked about already, so I won't go over it too much. But what I want to say is that shape matters as well. So if you're talking about particles, yes, the smaller particles tend to go deep into your lungs, but if they're really small, they can also stay suspended in the air and you can breathe them out again. And particles are relatively easy to remove from the lungs through the cells that have mechanisms to get them out of your lung. Fibers are much harder to expel from the lungs, and they can get into your lungs quite deeply as well. So what do we know about the size of tire particles? Because those were the most important one outdoors. And I think this has been highlighted. It's very variable, it's very complex. And these 4 studies that are highlighted here show indeed that there's a wide variety of particles. So 2 studies found particles in a nanometer size, and 2 studies found them in a micrometer size. So depending on which study you believe, they end up deep or not. But are they found in lung tissue? So there are actually 3 studies that looked at microplastic particles and fibers in lung tissue. And they found that the most common one was polyester, which makes sense because that was the one most found indoors where we spend most of our time. But also polypropylene, polyethylene and nylon. So no road dust particles or tire wear particles. But that isn't to say that they're not there, because these analyses can only pick up rather large particles. So anything that's nano-sized you cannot pick up with these techniques. Either my pictures are too big or the... there it is. So what do we know about health effects of these tire particles? So there are not actually an awful lot of studies out there. There are a few in vitro and in vivo studies, and I must say that most of these studies focus on acute toxicity, overloading cells or animals with these particles, and then looking at immediate effects. While in reality, of course, we're exposed to very low concentrations for a very long time. And there's epidemiology, which suggests that it's harmful, but as I said before, it's very difficult to disentangle the effects of these pollutants from other pollutants. So there's a little bit more information about exposure to microplastics from exposure from an occupational setting. And these studies are quite old, from the 70s and the 80s, but they showed that people who are working in the nylon flocking industry actually have a high chance of developing respiratory symptoms. So a shocking number, I think about 30% of these people developed inflamed airways, inflamed air sacs, so really negative effects. But of course they are exposed to very high concentrations that we don't have in our homes generally. So to look at this, the Dutch government decided that it was time for a concentrated approach to look at the problem of microplastic pollution. So they funded this consortium called Momentum, and which I'm part of, to look at the problem from different angles. So we have people who actually make environmentally relevant particles, characterize them well. We have people who look at exposure, and we have people who look at hazards, so people like me looking at health effects. And these data are all concentrated and put into models for risk assessment, and there are also people looking at solutions. So it's a very nice approach, I think, to tackle specific types of microplastics. So we have 3 types of particles that we're looking at the moment: nylon, polyester, and polypropylene. And we might be looking at tire dust as well at some point. So what I was interested in was what textile fibers actually do to our lungs. So this is not traffic related, but it is something that we are exposed to a lot because we spend most of our time indoors and we wear all these synthetic clothing and we have synthetic textiles. And we were particularly interested in a more physiological model that doesn't overload and look at acute effects. So we used a novel model for this, and we used sort of a reference microfibers that we made ourselves. And we looked at polyester and at nylon. So these are the actual fibers that we used, and the polyester fibers are a little bit bigger. They're 15 by 45 micrometers. The nylon is 10 by 30 micrometers. And we used this in our model of lung organoids, also known as mini lungs. And these mini lungs really represent growth of lung tissue or repair of lung tissue, so a longer term mechanism. And so how do we make these? We either get lung tissue from people undergoing a lung transplantation, or we get tissue from mice, and we isolate. We make them into single-cell solutions, and we isolate the epithelial cells from these suspensions. And the epithelial cells are the cells that are lining the airways, so those are the ones that get into contact with anything that you breathe in first. Then we put these cells into a gel with feeding and lots of love and cuddling, and they grow into these little structures that really resemble lung tissue. So they either become sort of tube-like airways or little bunches of grapes that resemble air sacs. And then we either add fibers or not. So this is what they actually look like in a dish. So on the left for you, you see this tube-like structure, which really is made of cells that are also present in airways in your body. And on the right, you have the structures that resemble the air sacs. And when we add the fibers to these growing structures, then you see things happening. So on the left, you see the control condition. You see these big bubbles. Those are the airways, and there are these smaller, darker structures that are the air sacs. And if you add the polyester, you clearly see the fibers. There's some effect, but not very profound. While with adding nylon, you actually completely lose all these big bubbles. So there are still some of these air sacs, but all the big bubble airways are gone. So that's scary. And we also made a movie of this, just to show you what happens, because these cells or structures, they grow for 14 days. So here you can see what happens in these 14 days. In the control condition, you really see these bubbles growing, while in the nylon exposed group, there are far less of these bubbles developing. So of course we wanted to know what is doing this. And we quantified this. This is not just one experiment, and here you can see that the airways are really, really profoundly inhibited by nylon exposure, while the air sacs are not very much. And polyester didn't do a lot either, so we focused our attention on nylon. There we go. So our next question was, is this the actual fiber itself, or is there something leaching from these fibers? Because plastic is not just one material, right? Lots of things have been added to plastic to improve the properties. So think about BPA, phthalates. So we designed an experiment to look at this. And in one condition, we added the fibers to the gel, as we did before, with direct contact between the cells and the fibers. But we also had a condition where we added the fibers on top, so there was no direct contact, and we made a fiber wash, just adding this wash and not the fibers at all. And this was quite clear. We didn't see much happening in the air sacs, but if you look at the airways again on the left, you see when you add the nylon to the gel, again, profound inhibition, but so did fibers on top, and so did the fiber wash. So this suggests actually that it's something leaching from nylon that's causing this effect. So what is it, you wonder? And we looked at that in detail, and we quantified things in this leachate, and we tested all the compounds that we could find, and none of them was responsible for this effect. So that's very frustrating. I don't know the answer to this. But what I do know is that it's probably something which is present in a very low concentration. And that scares me, because that means that it has a very profound effect in a very low concentration. But I hope to come back at some point to tell you what it actually is. The other question that we wanted to answer is, does this compound also affect already developed lungs? Because in our model, we add the fibers from the start, right? While the structures are developing. So as we're sitting here, we all have sort of developed lungs, hopefully not lungs that are damaged that are repairing. So does it affect these already ready-made lungs? And to investigate that, we slightly changed the model. So we let these structures grow for 14 days, and then we added the nylon and let them grow for another 21 days. Now this is just the airways I'm showing you. It's quite a complicated graph, but the first two conditions are the control conditions, grown for either 14 days or 21 days. Then the next two is when the nylon was added to the cells from the start, so for 14 or 21 days. Again, profound inhibition of the airways. But if we added the nylon on day 14, either on top of the gel or as a nylon wash, we didn't see much happening. That's good news for most of us, because that means that when you breathe them in while you're an adult, it probably doesn't have the same effect as it would have when you are a child or when you are a patient with repairing lungs. So it's not all good news, but there's a little bit of good news there. So in summary, exposure to nylon inhibits airway formation. We don't know what does this. But we do know that it's developing or the repairing airways that are particularly affected. And we do know that it's something leaching. So what are the implications of this? It means that developing or repairing lungs, so children or people with a lung disease, are most at risk. So they should keep their exposure down. But we don't actually know how much is dangerous. We know that people who work in this nylon flocking industry have problems, so probably that's a level that is dangerous, but we don't know how low you should go. So we need to assess exposure. And I mean, this is just we looked at polyester and nylon, right? And there's so many types of plastics, so many combinations. So what about all those other types of plastics? So there's still a lot of work to be done. In the meantime, what can you do yourself? I would say just keep plastic use down. Just try to reduce the amount of microplastic that is getting into our environment, which means ventilation. Unless you're living right next to a busy road, you might want to ventilate at times when there's not a lot of traffic, so possibly at night. And keep dust down, vacuum clean. I want to stop by acknowledging a lot of people who've worked on this project with me, but particularly the Dutch government for funding this and having the inspiration to be the forefront, I think, in the world in funding microplastics work. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay. Yeah, the Dutch are in the lead here. I just wanted to say that this reminded me of early in my training. There's a professor at Brown, I actually sent you the link, who was studying microplastics, or microfibers really, but same thing, and got fired. And you guys might not think of it this way, but I do. I think it's inspirational, and people don't realize that these industries have huge lobbies, and they feel threatened, and it's no joke. This guy lost his job from a full professor position. So you're fine. You're not going to lose your job, but this is very important work, is what I'm saying, and I don't take it lightly. How about some questions? Eric is there, and then Kathy, and yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation, and I'm just curious whether you've also done a control with the natural fibers like cotton or wool or anything like that.
Not yet. We do have some particle controls within the Momentum Consortium that are non-plastic, but we also had we had, for instance, PVC particles that weren't doing anything in my experiment, so I consider them sort of a control. But yeah, I would love to try cotton or wool, because we think about plastics having stuff added to them, but actually wool also contains many other components that can leach from them that could be dangerous. So it might not be plastic specific. I don't know yet.
Great presentation, and yeah, I mean, plastic is everywhere. And it's troubling. So it's echo the important work. How are you doing the exposures? Maybe I missed it. Was it liquid or was it aerosolized? And for the lung cells, and if you're not doing the aerosolization, what are some of the challenges? And do you think how would it differ in terms of potential impacts? I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, the way we did our exposures is because the cells are in this gel, we can't do aerosols, right? They have to be there from the start. So we were quite lucky that it's something leaching to show these effects. But we also exposed animals, but then we just did intranasal, because in your first experiment you really want to make sure that they get there to see if something is happening, and the next step would be doing aerosols, right, to see how much actually is deposited where. But that's future.
Yes, I'm concerned about children and asthma. I was wondering if any of these things would be affecting the children that you were talking about, affecting the kids' lungs at an early age, as to what might be bringing asthma on.
Well, there's a lot of, there's no data, right? So I can make some predictions or some estimations, or, well, that's not exactly the word I'm looking for, but so what can happen with plastics? They're very hydrophobic, so they tend to things tend to stick to them. So I can imagine that allergens can stick to plastics and thereby enhance sensitization. Hasn't been really tested yet, so don't know. But what I know, there is one study that looked at microplastics exposure versus children developing asthma, and the children with the highest exposure had the highest risk of developing asthma. So there appears to be a link, but it was one study. So, but I would be worried. Let me put it that way.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on sort of how much, kind of from an exposure perspective, could this be part of the PM problem, kind of in terms of outdoor air, or a new problem?
I think it's definitely part of the PM problem. I mean, we know that part of the PMs are plastic, but I think the previous speaker, especially Rima, has really nicely shown how difficult it is to disentangle all these different components. So the way we're trying to go at it is from the other side, just have very defined particles, defined exposures, and see what is happening in a multitude of models, and just model that all together, see if that could bring us something. But jury is still out there.
Thank you. This is fascinating. And maybe just a comment or to get your thoughts. So kind of building on this, but you know, children and infants are crawling on the floor a lot, right? And in the indoor environment, I mean, they're closer to carpets and putting their hands in their mouth, right? So from an exposure perspective, we worry a lot about dust and infants, as I'm sure you know. And I would guess that even if it's not airborne, if it's in the dust, there's other exposure pathways perhaps that are important. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, but it's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly why I think children are most at risk, because indeed of they're being closer to sources. There's been one Australian study that looked at that modeled how much people would get in, and they found actually that infants or children up to 2 years had a much higher exposure, also due to the lung volume versus body. So yes, I do think they might be exposed a lot more.
Okay. Before you go and before you hand over to Kathy, this is at risk of being a massively huge question, but I've kind of been wanting to ask this of every speaker this morning. What do you think about the role of you or others at your research center in terms of the relationship between the scientist and the policymakers and the government? Like, does GRIAC or anyone there actively seek out relationships so that your science, in this case microplastics, will have some kind of potential avenue into policy? Or is it more hopeful and sort of, put out the science and hope that it gets taken up by the people who are going to do something about it? It's a massively challenging, big question, but I kind of been wanting to ask everyone, and I'm curious what you think.
And I'm the lucky one who gets to answer it first. Okay. So actually, that's a thing in Holland, not just of the north of Holland, the place I'm from, is that the respiratory field doesn't have a very good connection to policy. So we're actively trying to make that better. And a lot of it is about awareness and making people aware that lung disease is not something that you do to yourself because you're smoking. But there's a lot of translate, and I don't know how that is in Canada, but somehow the respiratory world has doesn't have as good as a story as, for instance, the cardiology field has. So we're actively trying to improve that. I do know that the Momentum Consortium, however, does have connections to policymakers, so there is something happening there.
Awesome. That's really awesome. And we have DC Foundation doing its part. So thank you. Here you are, and thanks for making the trip. Okay.